Hello and welcome to Your Local Anthropologist. I'm your host, Elena, and this is my series, Utopia of Play. We are on episode 4 in the series. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. This episode is called The Altar of Exhaustion, or Why Elon Musk Pays Someone to Play His Video Games. In the last post, I traced how capitalism replaced play with games, promising transformation through transparent rules, how we're stuck performing adulthood in a system designed to keep us permanently dependent, and how, because of this system, we're too tired to imagine otherwise. I want to look closely now at how the cage maintains itself, not through explicit force, but through something more insidious, the weaponization of work itself, the transformation of labor from means to end, with exhaustion worn as a badge of virtue. Rules in the time of Corona. Most recently, in my own life, having left one of the most insidious corporate environments imaginable, it was possible to see in real time how the psychophancy works, how the submission to authority allows entire overhauls of the direction of the project on the whim of the hippo in the room, how, despite warnings that these new directions would not work, everyone performs enthusiasm about the shift. All these radical missteps become justified as part of the process, rather than the obvious incompetence and mismanagement of resources that they could equally be called. A place where toxicity wasn't abstract, it was ambient. Like goldfish in a poison tank, people swimming in circles for years, never imagining a different way to be. Some, of course, are attempting to change it from within. A respectable, if misguided, approach. As I describe this, I realize I could be talking about any large corporation. The same story exists in Google, Meta, and beyond. Google's rest and vest culture, where employees literally do nothing for years while collecting salaries because the bureaucracy forgot they exist. Meta laying off 11,000 people by email in 2022, including engineers who'd just relocated their families internationally for the job. The Amazon warehouse, where workers died during a tornado because they weren't allowed to leave their shifts. Many leave, some try to fight from the inside. Neither option resulting in the type of change required to open the cage door. It's hard to dream when exhaustion becomes the air. These are some of the most desirable jobs around, and still they make tangible the contradiction between the supposed privilege of working there and the actual human cost of doing so. It is crazy to me that this is pitched to us as success, something to desire or aspire to. I'm not even convinced this is living. After years freelancing, stepping back into this corporate bowl was like breathing underwater. Every breath rationed, every gesture calibrated to performances of productivity. And that company wasn't an exception, just a particularly sharp version of the same ecosystem that produces rigid rituals, unquestioned loyalty, silent punishments, you name it. And then COVID hit. For a moment, the mask slipped. Suddenly, flexibility wasn't impossible. Work-life balance wasn't luxury, it was survival. We remembered what it was like to have time, to cook dinner, to see daylight, to exist in our bodies without monetizing every moment. Companies discovered, miraculously, that all the things they'd insisted were impossible for years could be implemented within weeks when forced by external regulation. Remote work, suddenly seamless. Flexible hours, no problem. Trust-based management, absolutely possible. The infrastructure that couldn't support work from home was up and running before the month was out. The demands for physical presence, the surveillance, the inflexibility, none of it was necessary for the work to get done. It was necessary for control, and the moment that external force, government mandates, public health orders were lifted, the control snapped back into place. Watch what companies do when they're not being watched. They revert. Because the paternalism, the sudden care for employee well-being, was never genuine concern. It was compliance, forced accommodation that evaporated the instant force was removed. One wonders whether they'd have bothered with any of it, social distancing, masks, remote work, if they hadn't been legally required to do so. The evidence suggests not. And then just as quickly, the illusion closed again. The same leaders who praised well-being quietly reinstated surveillance tools and 5-day return to office mandates. In one instance, I recall, in late 2019, the VP of product did not want anyone working from home under any circumstances until the office ran out of desks. We must work together was the reason given. Then suddenly we were asked to stay home 2 to 3 days a week so the team could grow. Apparently, it was now possible to work effectively while being physically apart for some portion of the week. This type of illogical demand was happening before the world experienced COVID. In another role, a few years after COVID hit, an email was sent out to the whole company reiterating that they had no desire to return to the old ways, referring to the lack of flexibility pre-pandemic. We were told this would not be a step toward a 5-day in-office environment. Weeks later, we received that very demand. Somewhere, The evidence of such exchanges are enshrined in email history. If this is a game, no one is having fun. One can only laugh and lick the boot or start planning the exit. What makes this particular form of control so effective is the illogic itself appears to be the point. When demands contradict themselves within weeks, when policies reverse without explanation, when what you were praised for yesterday becomes grounds for discipline today, you learn that the rules don't matter. What matters is your willingness to comply regardless of whether the rules make sense. This is about power asserting itself, not about productivity or efficiency or any of the business cases they dress it up in. It is about demonstrating that they can demand your physical presence for no reason other than because they can. That they can reverse course on a whim and you'll accept it. That they can make you commute 2 hours for a meeting that could have been an email, and you'll smile and say thank you. Arbitrariness is a feature, not a bug. It keeps you off balance. It prevents you from developing any stable understanding of what's expected because what's expected keeps changing. And in that instability, you become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for signals, trying to anticipate what they'll want next, performing not just productivity, but total availability, total compliance, total surrender of your time, body, and attention. It is the same modus operandi of a domestic abuse relationship. David Graeber identified this as the hidden function of bureaucracy, not to make systems more efficient, but to demonstrate and perpetuate power through the imposition of meaningless rules. In his book, The Utopia of Rules, he argues that bureaucratic procedures aren't rational despite their appearance of rationality. They're violence that requires the victim to fill out forms. They're power that makes you complicit in your own subjugation by forcing you to follow processes that serve no purpose except to remind you who is in charge. The return to office mandates aren't about collaboration or company culture or any of the justifications offered. They're about reasserting control over bodies that briefly tasted freedom. The email reversals aren't mistakes, they're demonstration. The illogical policies aren't failures of management, they're assertions of authority. Graeber calls this the iron law of liberalism. Those in power get to act capriciously, changing rules and expectations on a whim, whilst those who subject to power must follow rules absolutely, even when those rules contradict themselves. The powerful get to be human and responsive to circumstances. Everyone else gets to be rigidly compliant. As Michel Foucault warned, we don't just obey power, we internalize it. We become our own managers, tracking sleep, hacking mornings, optimizing leisure, trying to accommodate the policies or navigate them in such a way that it won't cost you the chance of a promotion, but never stopping to ask why you'd want it in the first place, why the entire structure is allowed to perpetuate when so many of us would despise it if we stopped to look it in the eye. This is the altar of exhaustion, and we're all worshipping at it, even as it demands our bodies, our time, our imaginations as sacrifice. And the altar will stop at nothing, including the demand for Mother Nature herself. Action as agency. The part of this experience I can't shake is, what was the point? Why did we rush so impulsively back to a world that was so clearly unable to serve us? Us, as human social beings desperate for time and communities and for our labor to serve a purpose. While I watched corporate leaders refurbish their offices in lavish ritualistic flexes of power while telling staff there was no budget for bonuses, all I could think of is how nothing demonstrably meaningful for the betterment of myself or to improve the world around us came from these environments of dysfunction. The entire corporate world almost exists as its own Tower of Babel to capitalism, everyone speaking different corporate tongues, building higher and higher toward nothing, dedicating entire lives to artificial rush, processes, hierarchy, and the reinforcement of dysfunction. Of course, it has also been incredibly profitable. Someone's pockets were lined whilst thousands of people were exploited. Much of the obvious reasoning for return to office mandates ties into real estate value and landlord losses. Eye-watering sums of money poured into capitalist playgrounds that could otherwise have contributed to solving actual human problems. With millions of people pouring 40+ hours a week of their time into work, how have we not already built a more equitable and desirable world? It seems absurd that so much labor hasn't given us so little. Meanwhile, the world burns and people are too busy doing rituals to capitalism to put the fire out. I was on a Zoom call about improving data tracking in a video game when Dnipro was bombed by Russia, and I wondered, is this living? When these tragedies strike closer to your loved ones, it becomes impossible not to notice the absurdity of this entire structure, unless of course you numb yourself to it entirely. This is precisely what Hannah Arendt revealed in her discussions on work. When labor colonizes all available time, political action becomes impossible. Not just difficult, impossible. We're optimizing game metrics while cities are burning. We're in meetings about meetings whilst democracy is collapsing. The world has become a stage for collapsing empires, and we're too exhausted to do anything but clock in. Practically speaking, I'm sure we all have bills to pay on top of this. But we're not just working at work anymore. The boundary between labor and life has dissolved entirely. This is what Ian Bogost calls hyperemployment. Our phones turn us into perpetual workers. When you post on social media or check emails, you're doing unpaid work for companies that aggregate and resell your data. Rather than exploitation through wages, although we have that too, we do tiny bits of work for technology companies all day, every day. The fetishization of work runs deeper than offices. Every commute to sit at desks, on calls, in calendars clogged with meetings that could have been silence, in paychecks that shrink against living costs. There is no time to imagine alternatives, and that's the point. Action is what makes us fully human, Arendt argues. It's where we exercise freedom, where we reveal who we are through speech and deed, where we participate in shaping the world that we share. But action requires the very thing our system forecloses: time, energy. The mental space to think beyond survival, the capacity to imagine that things could be different. We're too tired to show up to community meetings, too depleted to organize, too anxious about our own precarity to think about collective solutions. The profits of the grind. You just have to put in 80 to 100-hour weeks every week. A quote from a coke-addled creep tweeting so prolifically you'd think he's unemployed. The same one who paid someone else to grind his Diablo character to level 97 so he could cosplay as a gamer. Watch him closely. He's not working those hours. He's shitposting, buying companies on ketamine logic, having public meltdowns that tank stock prices. But somehow that counts as work when he does it. Meanwhile, his employees sleep under desks, piss in bottles, grind themselves to dust for the privilege of making him richer. This is end-stage game logic. Your 100-hour week makes his tweets possible. Your burned-out nervous system is his passive income. And when you finally break, he'll tweet about how no one wants to work anymore between rounds of Elden Ring that someone else is probably playing for him. The prophets of hustle culture share a telling pattern. They preach the gospel of grind while systematically outsourcing the labor that makes their lifestyle possible. Jeff Bezos preaches customer obsession whilst warehouse workers develop chronic injuries meeting impossible quotas. Tech founders glorify monk mode productivity whilst nannies raise their children and personal assistants manage their lives. The venture capitalist tweets about 5 a.m. routines whilst an underpaid executive assistant coordinates his calendar, a meal prep service delivers his optimized nutrition, and a cleaner maintains the minimalistic aesthetic that signals his discipline. This performance is the point. When a CEO posts about grinding through weekends, he's not describing work. He's demonstrating that his time is his own to spend, even if he chooses to spend it working. The warehouse worker who actually grinds through weekends has no choice. That's the difference. The prophet of grind gets to perform exhaustion as virtue. The person actually exhausted just gets exhausted. You see this a lot in video games where the leaders boast about how exhausting and how much grinding they had to do to get the game shipped. Little mention made of all the employees who were forced to do so through pressure or literally through their contracts. Max Weber was documenting this transformation before the tech boom, before hustle culture, before the gospel of grind became a religion with its own prophets and martyrs, how religious anxiety became work discipline, how salvation through grace became salvation through productivity. Now, the altar isn't in a church, it's in an open plan office. The sacrifice isn't symbolic, it's your actual body, your actual time, your actual capacity to imagine anything beyond the next sprint. Output became virtue and stillness became sin. Leisure wasn't a right, it was a transaction you had to earn like a reward, and only after you'd performed. Under capitalism, play is only permitted when it performs, when it produces, when it's dressed up in the aesthetics of work, discipline, strategic, monetizable. Play is safe only when it imitates labor, otherwise it is a risk we must apologize for. This cultural logic surfaces in my own life. As someone who does many things purely for joy or learning, I've noticed how quickly that triggers suspicion. I have noticed the subtle, constant correlation between paid labor and perceived legitimacy. The skills I can monetize feel valuable. The ones I can't, the ones I love, feel harder to justify. I ask myself, is this only a hobby until I can live off it? At what point does it count? Can I still invest in myself for the joy of it if there is no return on investment? Even the things we make in our spare time, art, writing, crafts, stories, are diminished through the language of hobbies, dismissed as indulgent and frivolous, less than, even when they require skill and discipline. The problem isn't the work, it's that these forms don't guarantee profit. They aren't legible to capital. So the value system of capital attaches itself to them even when we don't intend for it to. This anxiety creeps into everything. Even as I write, even as I play, even as I tend to something joyful, I feel that internalized voice saying, what are you making? What are you worth? Hedonia. Even our leisure becomes colonized by the same logic as work. Cultural theorist Mark Fisher called it depressive hedonia, hollow pleasure where we seek numbness, not joy. The system doesn't just steal our time, it curates our desires. You're not resting, you're doom scrolling. You're not choosing joy, you're choosing the least painful way to become functional again. Fisher traced how late capitalism doesn't just demand our labor, it demands our attention, our dreams, our unconscious. We can't escape even in sleep because we're anxious about tomorrow's deadlines. We can't relax because relaxation feels like falling behind. We can't play because play doesn't produce anything quantifiable. South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls this the achievement society. We no longer need bosses to exploit us, we exploit ourselves. We internalize productivity so deeply that even joy feels like failure if it doesn't produce something. Your mindfulness has metrics, your hobbies need hustle. Your morning routine requires optimization. Your relationships become networking opportunities. Han argues that we've moved from a disciplinary society where power operates through external surveillance and punishment to an achievement society where power operates through self-exploitation disguised as freedom. You're not forced to work 80-hour weeks, you choose to. You're not ordered to check email at midnight, you just can't help yourself. The violence is self-inflicted, which makes it harder to resist because there's no clear oppressor, just your own inability to be productive enough, successful enough, optimized enough. Cultural theorist Lorraine Berlant described how we stay attached to fantasies that harm us. She called it cruel optimism, when the thing you desire is actually an obstacle to your own flourishing. We keep grinding because we think rest is on the other side of output. We think joy is something that can be earned, and we can't see that the whole structure is designed to withhold it. Berlant's concept helps explain why we accept conditions that exhaust us. We're optimistic that if we work hard enough, hustle long enough, optimize perfectly enough, we'll finally achieve the good life we've been promised. But that optimism is cruel because the promise itself is the mechanism of our exploitation. The carrot stays forever out of reach, and we blame ourselves for not running fast enough rather than questioning why we're running at all. These are not just theories. Look at how we relax. Instagram stories of self-care, routines that require purchasing products, LinkedIn posts about weekend side hustles that turn hobbies into income streams, TikToks of morning routines optimized for productivity, complete with affiliate links to the supplements and apps that make it possible. We're not living anymore. We're performing living. Every moment becomes content. Every experience becomes material for personal branding. Even our protests became aesthetic. Black squares on Instagram instead of organizing, hashtag activism instead of actual resistance. We consume the image of change rather than creating it. We perform solidarity while scrolling through atrocities between sponsored posts. The algorithm rewards performance, not action. There is a famous quote by Frederick Jameson where he says, "It is now easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." Leisure becomes not liberation but distraction and a buffer against a utopian desire. We're allowed to imagine apocalypse, zombies, nuclear winter, alien invasions, but imagining a world without bosses, without rent, without the 40-hour work week? That's utopian fantasy. That's unrealistic. That's naive. Cultural theorist Theodor Adorno wrote about what he called the culture industry, how mass entertainment under capitalism doesn't liberate us, but keeps us pacified. He argued that the leisure we're sold isn't really leisure at all. It's designed to reproduce the conditions that make us good workers, passive, uncritical, too drained to imagine alternatives. The songs, the films, the TV shows, they're standardized products that give us just enough pleasure to keep us consuming, but never enough to make us feel truly alive or dangerously free. Adorno is also the man who hated TV and jazz and who treated fun like a moral failure. His disdain for entertainment, his absolute opposition to the popular, always struck me as unnecessarily severe. When I first came across him in university, he reminded me of a certain kind of man, you know, the type who refuses to enjoy anything unless it's obscure or punishing or politically serious. The kind of man who rates every film 3 stars and calls joy or fun basic. Nothing is ever good enough for this cultural auteur who treats enthusiasm like a character flaw. It's true that Adorno's observations sometimes come across like an insufferable dating profile, but I'll admit, what once felt like elitist pessimism now reads disturbingly like prophecy. When I catch myself doom-scrolling after work or numbing out to yet another algorithm-shaped series, I can feel it, that watered-down version of leisure. It's not rest, it's just recovery, just enough to make me feel functional again. Adorno would say that's exactly the point. The culture industry doesn't want us rested and dangerous, it wants us numbed and compliant. Our free time keeps us just functional enough to clock back in. The aesthetic of busyness requires constant performance. You're not just working, you're also demonstrating that you're working. The Slack message sent at 11 p.m., the email timestamp 6 a.m., the LinkedIn humble brag about no days off, the Instagram story from the airport captioned grinding, the podcast about optimizing your morning routine, the app that tracks your productivity, the courses on how to hustle harder, how to monetize your hobbies. We've created an entire industry around performing exhaustion, productivity porn, hustle culture. The aesthetics aren't about actual output, it's about appearing perpetually busy. It's capitalist virtue signaling, and we've invited it from the office into our homes, our social media profiles, and probably even our thoughts. This performance makes actual rest impossible, because rest now needs to be earned. You're not just resting, you're practicing self-care, or recharging your batteries, or investing in your mental health, or setting your boundaries. And even rest becomes work. Even stillness requires a business case. Rules worth breaking. Even in writing this series, I'm breaking rules. Academic writing operates by its own game logic, citation formats, argument structures, deference to dead white men who said it first, a whole multi-year-long rite of passage and ritual run like an MLM. The real rules stay unspoken. Who you cite, how you perform intelligence, the delicate dance of agreeing just enough with your supervisor while pretending to think independently. I remember trying to write about feeling, just feeling, and being told I needed a citation. My actual lived experience needed academic validation to count as knowledge. I spent hours hunting for someone with a PhD who'd felt what I felt so I could footnote my own life. This series, it's stitched from pieces of my master's thesis, reworded, reshaped, set free from academic acceptability, rewritten because I wanted to, because it gave me pleasure, because the ideas deserved better than to die in a PDF that no one would ever read. There is no certificate waiting at the end, no external examiner, only you guys listening and maybe the ideas that live on the other end of where this may go. And still here it is, and I really hope it makes you think about your own life in some kind of way, some kind of liberating way. This too is play, this writing without institutional purpose, this thinking without assessment criteria. And in this play, I hope we can rediscover the type of imagination and joy required to set us free. Joy as political action. As a thought exercise, I wonder what would happen if we all agreed to stop performing busyness. What if we chose to prioritize our friends and loved ones over our bosses, or pay deep attention to who is getting the best of our time, our love, our bodies, and who benefits from our exhaustion? This is where joy becomes political, not the commodified joy of self-care, Sundays, or mindfulness apps, not the joy that requires a wellness budget or a subscription paid for through the workplace benefit program, but joy as what Audre Lorde called a serious threat to the status quo, joy that refuses to justify itself, that doesn't produce anything except more joy. Lorde wrote, "The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings." She wasn't talking about sex, though that's part of it. She was talking about the capacity to feel deeply, to want deeply, to know viscerally what nourishes us and what depletes us. And she argued that systems of oppression require us to lose touch with that knowing, because once you remember what genuine satisfaction feels like, you stop accepting counterfeits. It's not just energy that exhaustion steals, but the capacity to know what we actually want and need, what actually brings us alive. When you're tired enough, you'll take whatever's offered. You'll accept that doom scrolling counts as rest, or that grinding counts as purpose. You'll accept that this is some type of transitioning phase of hard work and fall productivity to get you some weekends of rest or a holiday a year, instead of stopping to ask why it's all so little and why all that labor isn't radically transforming the world around us for the better. Lorde understood that reclaiming the erotic, reclaiming our capacity to feel and want and know, what nourishes us, is fundamentally a political act. It's how we recognize when we're being exploited. It's how we distinguish between work that enlivens us and work that drains us. It's how we remember that we're not machines designed for productivity, but humans designed for connection and creativity. The cult of productivity serves those at the top while grinding down those at the bottom. Bell Hooks wrote about how dominator culture requires the destruction of community, the severing of bonds, and the atomization of people into isolated units of production and consumption, because connected people remember they have choices and are able to imagine together. Hooks argued that love, genuine love, requires time and attention and presence, all the things that exhaustion makes impossible. People who are tired won't show up for each other, and they won't build communities. They won't care about collective thriving when they're anxious about survival. It's made all of us easier to exploit, easier to convince that there's no alternative. Collective imagination is a threat to power. Individual burnout is a problem that can be solved with personal optimization or better boundaries or more resilience, some kind of mantra of work-life balance. Billion-dollar wellness industries exist to sell us solutions to problems the system created, but collective recognition that the system itself is broken, that we're not failing at capitalism, but that capitalism is failing us, that's a different kind of recognition. Emma Goldman famously said that if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. There's something crucial about that movements for liberation can't be built on the same logic of self-sacrifice and joylessness that oppression demands. That actually joy is evidence of our aliveness and proof that we haven't fully been beaten down, a resource more dangerous than anger because it shows what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against. Goldman's anarchist circles in the early 1900s were criticized for holding dances, for laughing, for finding pleasure in each other's company. But Goldman recognized that joy, especially collective joy, was itself revolutionary. It demonstrated that another way of being was possible. It created spaces where people could experience what life might feel like without bosses, without hierarchy, without a constant grind. It was a practice for the world they were trying to build. So, as a thought exercise, ask yourselves, what would happen when enough of us remember that joy, that unmonetized and unapologetic, is how we keep imagination alive? What happens when we recognize that rest is not selfishness but preparation? That play isn't childish but essential? That leisure isn't laziness but the space where we remember how to be human? Maybe the answer isn't doing more, but doing it differently. Maybe we start by making space for purposeless play, for prioritizing our communities over our jobs, by resisting the urge to turn every spark into a side hustle, every curiosity into a career path. Maybe you'll think of ideas too, better ones than I can. Because once we remember that joy is political, that it always has been, we stop asking whether play is productive and start asking what makes it possible. And those questions beget more questions, like who benefits from our busyness? Whose rules are we following? Why are some of us drowning whilst others are thriving? Who built the tank and who maintains it and who profits from keeping us swimming in circles? The exhaustion itself is not equally distributed. The cult of productivity doesn't grind everyone down in the same way. And that's where we need to look to next, not at the goldfish tank in general, but at who's swimming and who's drowning, whose exhaustion gets valorized and whose gets ignored, and how the systems we've been describing don't just exploit everyone equally, they exploit some people's bodies and time and labor to subsidize others' comfort. The altar of exhaustion demands sacrifice, but it's time we ask whose bodies are on the altar and who is doing the sacrificing. Thank you so much for listening if you made it this far. On the next episode of Utopia of Play, I'll be looking at the Oppression Olympics. If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to learn more about the theorists mentioned, then you can find the references in the show notes. This series is available to read on your localanthropologist.com, where you can also sign up to a newsletter to get updates when I post new content. I'm your host, Alina, and this is your local anthropologist.